Welcome back to our reading of the Gospel of Matthew, and today we're going to be reading, commenting on chapters 8 to 10. Chapter 8 and 9 are really just 10 miracles relating to Jesus. They are really a unit. We will look at each one of them individually, but really they're meant to be taken as a unit because they are meant to be a proclamation about Jesus. And the proclamation is the authority of Jesus over illness, creation, demons, sin, and even death. So it's an illustration of Jesus in action in his mission, but pointing to his authority. We'll also see in these stories, these miracle stories, the importance of faith. Faith is the appropriate way to respond to Jesus, and it's the faith of people involved that causes him to act. We'll also see, as we often see in Matthew, Jesus as the fulfillment of prophecy. Remember, Matthew is the gospel that's for whom it's most important that Christians remember that we have an Old Testament background. At the time he wrote, it was a time when new things were happening. The community was opening up to Gentiles, but Matthew is the gospel that keeps reminding us that our origins were in the history of the Jewish people. So we'll see just a little bit of that coming through in these chapters as well. They'll all show something a little bit about discipleship. In between the 10 miracles, there's a few little interludes that talk about discipleship, and we'll dwell on those as we come to them. The opposition of leaders is begun to be shown clearly in these miracles. So they all prepare for chapter 10, which is the apostolic discourse, the discourse about the mission of the disciples. So really this section of the gospel is seen very clearly as a unit in itself. But however, let's begin by looking at the texts themselves. You can see that the first of the miracles is the cure of the man with leprosy. After he had come down from the mountain, large crowds followed him, and a leper came up to him. And notice that the statement there, if you are willing, you can cure me. Very often the way the person asks is an indication of their faith. And Jesus touches him, just as he touched the mother-in-law of Peter, and his sickness, his leprosy, is cured. Really, just touching him was a significant thing because with lepers, one didn't touch lepers, and even touching people wasn't exactly done, but Jesus uses touch as a way of actually healing people. It's interesting to note that he sends him away, but he tells him to observe what the law says about offering the prescribed sacrifices as prescribed by Moses. So you see Jesus is acting as a Jew, recognising the Old Testament and suggesting that what he has done could be carried through by observing the sacrifices offering by Moses. The next miracle there is the cure of the centurion servant. So the centurion was a soldier who was in charge of 100 soldiers, and he comes up and pleads with Jesus. And his plea is also an act of faith. Lord, my servant is lying at home paralysed and in terrible pain. And Jesus says, I will come myself and cure him. Again, something that would not have been done. The Jews wouldn't have entered the house of a Gentile, but Jesus says that he's going to come. But the centurion acknowledges that he's a person that has people under him and that he's not really a person that is worthy of the Lord coming to his house. And he has that saying that really he's the sort of person that would not expect the Lord to come to him. And when he says that, Jesus makes the point that he hasn't heard such faith even in Israel. Throughout the gospel, Jesus will talk about the disciples as having little faith. But on two occasions, he will point to two people, both Gentiles, with whom he says have had great faith. And he's actually astonished, saying that he had not seen such faith even in Israel. He then goes on to make the comment that people come from east and west to sit down with Abraham and Isaac, but the people of the kingdom will not be there. And again, I think he's pointing there to the fact that the gospel will be opened up to other people, and as a result, because they have not responded, some of the Jewish people will be left outside. So again, it's a question of a miracle, and at the end, the Lord says, as you have believed, let it happen. So again, pointing to the fact that the miracle has been worked in the light of the faith of the one who has believed. The next miracle concerns Peter, and they go back to Peter's house. Peter worked from Capernaum, and they go back with the disciples. The disciples are not mentioned as to the four as they are in Mark, but nevertheless we presume that they're with him. So it's Peter's mother-in-law who is lying down and feverish. So just as he touched the leper, Jesus touches her hand as well, and the cinema and the fever actually left her. And then she goes on to serve them. There are certain words in the gospel that are key words, and one of the words is the word to serve. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. That's in Mark, but even in Matthew, we find the fact that service is the thing. So often when a word like that is used, we can see a meaning in it that's a bit different to its normal significance. Now, while he's there, many people who are looking for cures were brought to him. So you see that he cures many people. They brought to him many, and he fulfills them. And then he makes the point that this is something that was foretold by the prophets. He quotes Isaiah from the suffering servant text. He himself bore our sicknesses away and carried our diseases. So here's another occasion where Matthew is pointing to the Old Testament and saying that Jesus is fulfilling what has happened. This is not new. You should almost have expected this to happen. So then there are many cures, and then one of the scribes comes up and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus says, "Foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." I think the meaning there is that to say to this man that really to follow Jesus is really is a difficult following. You'll notice there he talks about the Son of Man, and I've mentioned before that the Son of Man is a title that Jesus uses in relationship to his mission. Son of God relates to his identity, Son of Man to his mission. So he's saying to this man, if you follow me, you can expect that it will be a difficult time. Another man came up and he said, "Lord, let me go first and bury my dead." I was reminded here of the call of Elisha by Elijah in the Old Testament. And Elisha wanted to go and fulfill his family obligations first. But Jesus says, "Follow me and leave the dead to bury the dead." I think the dead here are referring to those who have not responded to Jesus. And the point about following him immediately, this is saying something about the urgency of the kingdom. I think Jesus presents in these miracles and in the apostolic discourse that immediately follows the idea that the gospel, the preaching of the gospel, is something that is urgent and something that needs to be done immediately. The following story is the calming of the storm. So Jesus gets into the boat with his disciples. The disciples follow him there. Again, follow is another one of those magic words. You can just say, well, it's just pointing what they did. But it's one of those words that sums up that the disciples go after Jesus, not just in terms of normal movement, but in terms of who he is and their commitment to him. So what happens is, and it often happens on the Lake of Gennesaret, a storm breaks out rather suddenly, and the boat is beginning to be swamped. But Jesus is asleep. Being asleep seems normal, but in the Old Testament, being asleep in the midst of difficulties was really a sign of confidence in God. So Jesus is asleep, but notice the disconcern of the disciples. And so they wake him up and say, we are lost. And he says to them, why are you frightened, you who have so little faith? We've seen before how fear is the opposite of faith. In other words, he's saying to them, you should have had faith rather than being frightened. And of course, he's acknowledging here their lack of faith, and he stands up and rebukes the winds and the sea, and there is a dead calm. So the disciples again here are being seen as people who are struggling to understand the message of Jesus, and they're still fearing instead of having faith. What should they have done? Well, I think Jesus, asleep in the boat, is acknowledging that trust in God, that they needed to have trust in the master of the storm, Jesus, who was with them. So the question that they finish up with there is, what kind of man is this? As I said, that these miracles are talking about who is Jesus, and talking about Jesus in his mission, and people are wondering who he actually is. The next story there is the story about the demoniac. And Matthew here talks about two demoniacs coming towards him out of the tombs. You might recall that Mark had only one demoniac, but Matthew often has two, just as Mark had the cure of the blind man, Matthew has the cure of two blind men. So he seems to like doing things in two. So the description is much abbreviated. It's not as fully as Mark, but nevertheless the same point is being made. There's no description of how serious the dimension of this man was, but nevertheless it comes through that he was needing redemption. And the demons within him cry out, what do you want with us, Son of God? So again, it's the demons that know who Jesus is. And I've mentioned before, this goes back to the temptation of Jesus, the testing of Jesus in the desert. So it's there that the demons encountered Jesus, and it is there that Jesus overcame them. So throughout the gospel, they will always be the ones who know who Jesus is. And they acknowledge that with the titles that they use. So they say, have you come to torture us before the time? I think the time there is the last judgment. In other words, they would expect to be judged at that last day, but nevertheless they're saying it's happening before time. And then we've got that strange incident where they come out of the demons and they go into the pigs, and the pigs rush off into the sea and are killed. For the Jewish people, the sea is always the place of evil, the place where death actually takes place. What's the significance of the incident about the pigs? Well, I don't think there's any known significance, but one possibility is that it's a physical manifestation of the fact that the demons have been expelled. Shortly we'll see a miracle where Jesus first of all forgives sins and then works a miracle to prove that the sins have been forgiven. So I think it could be here that what we've got is that the putting the demons into the pigs and them falling away is really just a way of making clear that the demons have really been expelled. The people around there are fearing of Jesus. I suppose fearing is right, because they don't follow Jesus, but rather they ask that he might leave their land. They implored him to leave the neighbourhood. The next miracle is the cure of a paralytic. So he gets back in the boat and crosses the waters. Notice how Jesus is going backwards and forwards across the lake. And of course, on one side it's the Jewish side, and on the other side it's the Gentile side. And it's a way of showing that Jesus' message is being preached both to the Jews and to the Gentiles. So now a number of people bring him a paralytic. He doesn't have the story of Mark where they take away a bit of the roof and let the paralytic down, but it's basically the same story. And it begins by the fact that Jesus sees their faith. And of course, once Jesus sees their faith, then he is certainly open to act. And he says, "Take comfort, my child, your sins are forgiven." Now, some of the scribes were there, and they said, this man is blaspheming. And the reason being it is God's role to forgive sin. Matthew and the modern Gospels often have attributed to Jesus things that would have been attributed to Yahweh in the Old Testament, like walking on the water, for example. That was something that God would have done. And now, the forgiveness of sin, this is something that Yahweh would have done. So they see this as blasphemy, that Jesus is giving himself a divine status. So Jesus, knowing what was in their mind, I don't know that we need to see Jesus as reading their thoughts, because I think their reaction would have been fairly obvious. But he says to them, "Why do you think evil in your hearts?" And he asks the question, which is easier, to forgive sins or to say, "Get up and walk"? And to prove that the sins are forgiven, he works the miracle. So the man gets up and walks away and went home. So a feeling of awe came over the crowd when they saw this, and they glorified God for giving such authority to humans. I don't think we see here the crowd following Jesus. They're awed at what he does, but being awed with Jesus and respecting Jesus is not the same as being a disciple of Jesus. But the point is made that God is glorified through what Jesus has actually done. He will say to the disciples that they should lead their lives well, so that people who see them would give glory to God. And that's exactly what Jesus has done in this particular miracle. The next scene is a discipleship scene where Matthew is called. I like to say there's just sort of three things that happen when Jesus does this. He sees him, he calls him, and the disciple follows him. I think this was the same action that we saw in the call of the 4 disciples at the beginning of the gospel. So Matthew is a tax collector. So again, Jesus is reaching out to people who would not have been reached out by a good Jew at the time. And what follows, I think, is the result of this call of Matthew, because it's about a meal that Jesus is having in a house. And I think we can presume that it's Matthew's house. And a number of tax collectors and sinners were there sitting with Jesus and the disciples. And again, the Pharisees were concerned about this. It was against the practice. Why does your teacher eat with collectors, tax collectors and sinners? And Jesus, in responding to them, uses that phrase, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. It's an interesting phrase, because I think there Jesus is adopting the framework, the way the Pharisees look at things, because they would see the ones that Jesus is going to as to the sick. But also I think they would see themselves as the healthy. And I think there's a hidden reproof there of the Pharisees that really Jesus doesn't see them in that way. And that comes out with what he says about learning the text from the Old Testament. And again, Matthew is calling on the Old Testament to indicate that what Jesus is doing has been prophesied by the prophet Osee. My pleasure is in mercy, not sacrifice. In the context of what that happened in Osee, it was about the failure of the Jewish people to keep the covenant. And while mercy has significant for us, the Hebrew word for mercy, chesed, was really the mercy of the covenant. So it didn't just mean mercy in our sense, it meant the fact that people were not keeping the covenant. Now, of course, mercy would have been among that, but it's a much broader term and a much more serious term because it's pointing to the fact that the covenant that had been made with God and that they had agreed to, they are not living up to. So really, it's a reproof to the Pharisees, that he's saying that they have to learn about they have to live according to the covenant. And not sacrifice, not that he's doing away with sacrifice, but as we saw in the cleansing of the temple, what was happening was that people would continue the sacrifices that were going on, but the people weren't living up to the way of life, the covenant that was meant to be behind the sacrifices. I think we could apply this to our own day, that certainly we continue with the sacrifice, the Mass is continually offered, but are our people living up to the covenant? And I'm sure that some of the people who come to our Masses may not be living up to the covenant. So it's a sort of a thing that needs to be said about any religion. And Jesus affirms it again, I came to call not righteous but sinners. Again, the sinners, those who the Pharisees would have called sinners, and considering themselves righteous. So it's quite a serious challenge to the Pharisees. The next one comes about fasting. Then Jesus' disciples come to him. Notice it's John's disciples, not Jesus' disciples. John's disciples come to him and they're asking, why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not? You may recall from what we said in the Sermon on the Mount that fasting, almsgiving, prayer and fasting were sort of the backbone of Jewish spirituality, and fasting would have been a very normal thing. But they're saying that Jesus' attendants or Jesus' followers are not fasting. And Jesus uses the image that people don't fast at a wedding. But when the bridegroom is present, well, it's not a time for fasting, it's a time to be with the bridegroom. Now again, the bridegroom here is a title that would be used of Yahweh in the Old Testament. The bridegroom was Yahweh and the bride was Israel. So another subtle reference of Jesus' unique status. But he makes the point that when the bridegroom goes, then they will fast. He concludes then with two very interesting images. No one puts a piece of unshrunken cloth onto an old cloak because the patch pulls away from the cloak and a worse tear happens. Now, what he's describing is actually true, that the new section, as it shrinks, it tears away the parts of the unshrunken cloth. What I think he's talking about here is what he's often spoken about, as how the message that he brings can't simply be put into the Old Testament framework. I think we saw that earlier when we mentioned that really for the Old Testament be a new wineskin that's capable of the new wine, it had to be the Old Testament read in the light of the resurrection. And that's the point he's making, I think, in the new point there, the new image, that you can't have new wine in all wineskins because they burst. They burst. and the wine and the skins can be lost. But if you have new wineskins, he makes the point that both are preserved. That word both is only in Matthew. In other words, Matthew's concerned to show that, yes, you can't just put the new into the old. You've got to have new wineskins. You have to look at the old in terms of the resurrection of Jesus, and then both are saved. And this goes back to Jesus' points that he made in the Sermon on the Mount, that the Old Testament is not to be lost, and that people are meant to keep the requirements of the Old Testament. But when he went on then to point out that it's the Old Testament seen as he sees it, not as you have heard, but as I say, was the way he actually phrased it. So the Old Testament needs to be seen in terms of the fact that Jesus himself has risen. The next miracle there is the cure of the woman's daughter. The official's daughter raised to life. So one of the officials came up, and probably this would have been a Gentile as well. And he makes the point that his daughter has just died. So here's Jesus being challenged to actually overcome death and to recall to life a person that has died. So Jesus rises and with his disciples followed him. I mentioned with his disciples there, and I think Matthew mentioned, because we often see the disciples going with him, but they don't do anything at the time when the miracle happens. But they're there, and you can see them learning from what's happening with Jesus, and sometimes learning about what can happen. Remember when they went to Capernaum, and the people there didn't accept Jesus, and he was rejected by them. And so the disciples saw what would happen when they preached the gospel, that they would face the same thing of being objected to by them. So Jesus sets out to follow him to his daughter who is sick. Now we've got here the remains of a Markan sandwich, because the other miracle comes in between. And Matthew doesn't develop it in the same way as Mark did. It's a much briefer little bit in the middle, but it's about the woman who has been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years. She touches the fringe of his tunic. Notice the touching again. For she was thinking, if I just touch his tunic, I shall be saved. And Jesus turns and says, "Courage, my daughter, your faith has saved you." So just as in Mark, both of these characteristics, while they're moulded together, are actually about faith. So he goes on then, and from there the woman was saved. I think the saved there again is one of those words that means more than just being healed, but has a deeper significance as well. So they get to the official's house, and there's a whole group of people. When somebody had died in the Jewish tradition, a lot of people would gather. Some of them would be professional mourners to come and assist with the family of the one who had died. So Jesus says to them, "Get out of here, the little girl is not dead, she is asleep." And of course they ridicule Jesus, because the story has already narrated that the child is dead. So he sends them away, and then he goes in and he goes up to the body and takes her by the hand. Here's Jesus using touch again to celebrate the miracle, and she stood up, and the news spread around all the countryside. So again, like Mark, Jesus is well known, has a great reputation, and people come to him from all sides. But they don't all come to be disciples. They come out of wonder at what he is doing. The next miracle is about the two blind men. I mentioned already that Mark only has one, but as Matthew does sometimes, he turns the one into two. And these two blind men, knowing that Jesus is there, cry out, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." I think the famous Jesus prayer that's so popular in the East is a sort of a reflection of this saying. The Jesus prayer is, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. But it's a cry of mercy like we have here. Now, Son of David is important here. Mark doesn't use Son of David much. I think it only occurs once in Mark, but it occurs more in Matthew, I think about 5 times. And the reason is that he's linking Jesus to the Old Testament and to David. And of course, all of the Gospels link Jesus to David because the Messiah had to be a descendant of David. So when Jesus reached his house, the blind man came up and he asked, do you believe I can do this? In other words, he's asking them, do they have the faith that will prompt him to do what they ask? And they agree, and he touches their eyes, saying, to your faith, let it be done to you. To your faith, let it be done to you. In other words, it is the faith, their faith, that has actually enabled it to happen. But Jesus warns them, take care that nobody knows about it. Again, something that has come down from Mark, but I think is also present in Jesus too, that he is careful that the understanding of Messiahship that he has could be well misinterpreted by the people who had different expectations. But of course, when these two went away, then they talked about it to everybody, and everybody got to know what had happened. Now, I've dealt with the 12 miracles there, so could we pause now and be open for questions? We do have a question there. When Jesus calms the storm, the disciples ask, what kind of man is this? How does fear often blind us to who Jesus truly is? I think to respond to that, I just need to remind you that in a sense, fear is the opposite of faith. Not to have faith is to fear. To have faith is to have trust in God, no matter the difficulty of the situation. And I think that the point is being made that we are like Jesus. We are disciples of Jesus. And I think that we are going to meet the same sort of trials that he met, and that we are to adopt the same attitude. I think the fear here is not just human fear, it can be seen as that, but it's the fear that means that one is fearing but doesn't really have faith in Jesus. So the important thing about the comment that he makes is that really our attitude as disciples of Jesus should be people who have faith. And it's natural that we will have fear, but with faith, that fear can be turned into something that is positive. Let's continue. I think we need to say that those 10 miracles were a preparation for this particular discourse of Matthew, or of Jesus. I've mentioned before that Matthew and Luke had access to a document, not a document necessarily, but a source that had numerous sayings of Jesus. And they used those sayings differently. And Matthew uses them to signify 5 discourses throughout the gospel story. And he's liking Jesus to Moses, who gave the 5 books of the Torah. So again, a subtle illustration by Matthew of the fact that Jesus needs to be understood in terms of the Jewish salvation history. So here we are, he summons the 12. He summoned them earlier on to the mountain, and he actually singled out 12. And so what we've got here is the 12 disciples not just being called, but actually being sent out. And I think it's important, this sending out. In the Gospel of John, the principal title of Jesus is, he is the one who has been sent. So being sent as characteristic of who Jesus is in John. And I think what's happening here is that just as Jesus has been sent, now Jesus is sending out his disciples. And I think the sending out is very significant because it shows that Jesus is not just an individual Messiah who's just going to work it alone, but he has gathered around him a group of people who are to share in his mission and actually carry it on. People say, did Jesus found the church? Well, when we think of church, we think of today, obviously, but I don't know that Jesus founded the church in a formal way. But certainly, Jesus did gather people around him, and it was clear that their work was to carry on, and that the people who believed in him would form a unique group with leadership with the disciples and with the leadership of those who came after the disciples. So I think you can say that Jesus founded the church, or he set the scene in which the church was born, but I think we need to see the church in terms of Jesus. Now, he gives them the power over unclean spirits. In the opening verse there, he doesn't mention proclamation, but it's clear as it comes later in the verses that Jesus is giving them the same authorities that he had, to preach that the kingdom of God is near and to make cures over the various sicknesses and the demons. So he then goes on to say who the disciples are, and he says these are the names of the 12 apostles. Now that's the only place in the gospel where the word apostles is sent. And of course the word apostle from the Greek means the ones who are sent, but that's the only time that the word apostles is actually referred to. So then we've got the list of apostles there. Simon, of course, is first, as he usually is, and Judas is last, and Judas is always mentioned in terms of the fact that he is the one who betrayed Jesus. Notice that the others are linked together in twos. That may well have been how they went out in twos, because it was the Jewish practice to send out people in twos. You needed two people to bear witness, and so I think that could be the case why the disciples are linked together in twos. As they go down, you'll notice then that he does talk about proclamation, but before that he says, do not go into Gentile territory and do not enter any Samaritan town. Go instead to the lost sheep of Israel. Now, people sometimes are surprised at that, but we do need to recognise that Jesus is the Messiah of the Jewish people. In other words, the message that has come from the Father through Jesus begins in Israel. Now, of course, as it developed, it became clear that it could, it came to be expanded. You can remember in the Acts of the Apostles where Peter visits the house of Cornelius, and he sees there that God does to these Gentiles exactly what he did to the Jews, and therefore they must be included. And even in the Gospels, we've got the woman, the Syrophoenician woman, who was addressed as a dog by Jesus, a term that the Jews would have used for Gentiles, and she challenges him, and he actually turns round and does what she asks. So I think that's significant to recognise that Jesus came as the Messiah of the Jews. And of course that's important for Matthew. I keep referring to the fact that he is the member of the growing church that wants to remind people, yes, we're new, things are different, there are new wineskins, but we've got to look to the Old Testament and read it in the light of the resurrection of Jesus. So he tells them that they're to go out and proclaim that the kingdom of heaven is close at hand. That's his regular proclamation. He tells them to cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers. They're all the things that he did. They are to receive you have received without charge, give without charge. So they're there to give freely of the message of salvation that has been given. They're not to have any gold or silver, not even coppers, no bag for the journey. There's a certain urgency that they to get out and do it. And I think there's a certain trust in God that comes through here. that basically they're going to live off the hospitality of the people whom they serve. And they're told that to go to the various towns and villages, seek out somebody worthy and stay there until you leave. So as they enter the house, they are to say, "Peace be upon this house." And again, peace is another word that is significant in the message of the gospel. So if it does not respond to them, then they are to sort of say that as you walk out of the house, shake the dust from your feet. That's what the Jews used to do when they had been out into Gentile territory. And Jesus is now saying that these people have rejected the gospel. But he doesn't leave it there. He makes the point that when judgment time comes, they will have a harsher judgment than Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah were the great sinners of the Old Testament, two communities of sinners who were the model of what sin could do and be. So these people, because they reject Jesus, they're actually going to be judged more seriously. He then goes on to say that he's sending them out like sheep among wolves. Again, we see often, we'll see it in the last discourse of Jesus, how he constantly reminds them that they will be opposed just as he has been opposed. They are to be as cunning as snakes, yet innocent as doves. So that's how they are to approach the opposition that they are to receive. He then develops the idea of the fact that they will be opposed. Be prepared to people to hand you over to assemblies and scourge you in the synagogues. St. Paul makes the point that he was scourged, I think 3 times, might have been 5, but this was something that the Jews could do. They couldn't put people to death, but they could do certain physical things to them, and scourging was one of them. And they're going to be brought before various tribunals, and note that it's going to be done as evidence to them and to the Gentiles. In other words, their appearing before these tribunals is really the evidence of the gospel, that in that situation they are witnessing to what they stand for. And I think in a sense that's what Jesus did in his sufferings, that his death was the cost of doing what the Father asked him to do. And I think that the opposition that's taking place against the disciples is the cost of what Jesus has asked them to be and to do. And therefore, it's an evangelizing situation. But he makes the point that when this happens, don't worry about what to speak, because it's going to be the Spirit of your Father will be speaking in you. I always like to mention that the references in Matthew to your Father. It's not just simply the Father, it is your Father, which I think brings it into a much closer relationship. And the fact that when they are witnessing in this particular situation, it is the Spirit of God that is there and will enable them to act appropriately. At baptism we receive the gifts of the Spirit, and one of the gifts of the Spirit is fortitude, and its fortitude enables people to be martyred. I think we all think that we'd never be able to be martyred. That's something that's we just couldn't do. But I think the point here, and the point in having the gift of fortitude, is that if the occasion arose, then the Spirit would be there and would give us the courage that was needed to actually give our life for Jesus. So he goes on to say that brother will betray brother. In other words, all sorts of family dissension. Again, this is a prophecy from Malachi. And it's bringing out the fact that whenever salvation is proclaimed, there's 2 things that happen. Some accept it and others reject it. And I think we've seen in our own lifetime how families are divided by the fact that somebody turns to Christ and the others don't agree with that and cut them off entirely, and in some religions they could even want to kill them for doing that. So it's making the point that this is going to be one of the phenomena that takes place, that when salvation is presented, some will not take it, so there will be that division even among families. Notice he says that you'll be universally hated on account of my name. So we're talking about the opposition to Jesus. Right? And we often say today, oh, people are opposing the church. Right? In a sense, they are opposing Jesus. The church is meant to be Jesus bringing the message of Jesus to the people. And I think we often just see it as an attack on the institution. But really, I think it is an attack on the message that Jesus has brought from the Father, and needs to be seen in terms of an refusal of the message that Jesus has brought. So he makes the point, when you're persecuted in one town, go on to the next, and they won't be around the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. The other Son of Man, I think that refers to the fact that Jesus will be crucified and the Son of Man will be there in a new way after the resurrection. So he goes on then to talk about the disciple and the teacher, that the servant is not going to be greater than the master, but at least the disciple can aspire to be like the master. And I think that's what our faith is about. Basically, our faith is to try to come to a union with Jesus, so we live our life in union with him and manifest to people the message that Jesus brought. I think we've got to see that the message of Jesus was not just in his words and his action, but in himself. Those things came out of Jesus, but it was Jesus himself who is the message. And in St. John again, what is eternal life? It is believing in the one true God and the one he has sent. So it's belief in Jesus that our Christian life is about, and we always need to keep that personal dimension to the fore in the way we live. So I think the reference there to that they would not have gone around to all the towns until the Son of Man comes is referring to the fact that the resurrection will follow the suffering of Jesus. The last bit there about Beelzebub, I think that's just saying the same thing. If you say that about Beelzebub, you're saying that Beelzebub is the chief of demons, therefore the members of his household are naturally demons as well. He goes on then to speak about open and fearless speech. He says, do not be afraid of them. He's talking about those who are opposing the disciples. So it's not fear that they're meant to have, it's faith. Faith in the disciple, that the Spirit is going to be with him. He makes the point that all of the things that are hidden now will be revealed. And in their revelation, all the things that Jesus has come to do will be revealed. And what Jesus said to them in the dark, they are to tell in the light. What you hear in whispers, proclaim from the housetops. And again, do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Fear him rather who can destroy both body and soul in hell. And then he goes on, and this is important in terms of the opposition that they're going to meet, to say how precious the disciples of Jesus are in the eyes of the Father. The 2 sparrows was the cheapest offering that could be made in the temple. I think 2 sparrows was what Joseph and Mary offered when they took Jesus to the temple. So they're very cheap, but they make the point that not one of them falls to the ground without your Father knowing. So again, your Father. So there's a sense of intimacy that comes through in this sending out of the disciples. It's a very difficult picture that's painted, but it's surrounded with that familiar familiar family feeling of Jesus, the ones that he has called and the ones whom the fathers love. He uses another example there. The hairs on our head have actually been counted, that we are worth more than the sparrows and more than the hairs on our head. Counting the hairs on your head, that's a way of saying how important you are to the person who is doing the counting. And then he says, everyone who acknowledges me in the presence of others, I will acknowledge in the presence of my Father in heaven. So your Father and my Father, and we've seen our Father. I think those little, what are they? They're not adjectives, they're pronouns, I think, that they signify this relationship that we have with the Father. And the whole story here about them going out is that they're going to be opposed, that some people will acknowledge them, but others will not. And so those who acknowledge Jesus, he will acknowledge them in the presence of his Father, and those who do not acknowledge him, they will not be acknowledged by Jesus to his Father. He finishes up there by saying, do not suppose that I have come to bring peace on earth, but to bring not peace, but a sword. A sword here is not meant to be just a military sword. It's meant to be a sign of division. And the not peace there is the division that takes place between those who respond and those who do not respond. And Jesus speaks in other places about peace. My peace I give you. The peace that the world cannot give. They're taking peace in a different sense. They're in a different context. But here, what's being pointed out is that there's going to be division when anybody preaches the word. So he then goes on to repeat what he said earlier about family dissension. And I've mentioned already that this is articulating what was found in the prophet Malachi. And we saw in the call of the disciples how they had to leave family obligations behind and follow Jesus immediately. And the point here is that we can't let our family, father, mother, daughter or son, stand between us and Jesus. And he talks then about the cross, and I think that's the cross that very often we will be opposed by those that we love. But the meaning of that thing, anyone who does not take the cross and follow in my footsteps is not worthy of me. You might recall he has already said, anyone who will come after me must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And I mentioned that the cross is not just the wooden cross of Calvary. That the meaning of Calvary is what Jesus did. It's Jesus going forward in paying the cost of what it takes to do the will of the Father. And what's being said there is that we need to go forward, even in the difficult situations of our living our faith, that we need to go forward as Jesus did to the Father in those difficult situations. And he says there that anyone who finds his life will lose it. He's talking here about martyrdom. And anyone who loses his life for my sake, we've seen that a lot, on account of me, for my sake, they will find life. And it means that some people will have to take up the cross that will be the same as that of Jesus, not just death, but dying in order to stand faithful to the one who has sent them. Anyone who welcomes you welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. We're going to see in Matthew, one of the last chapters, that scene where Jesus says to some of the people there, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. When I was naked, you clothed me. As often as you did it to the least of my brethren, you did it to me. So he's affirming here that welcoming the disciples who are going out to preach, then they are welcoming Jesus. And anyone who welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. I mentioned that Jesus is the one who was sent, not as strongly presented in the Synoptics, but nevertheless very, very strong in Jesus, in John, and certainly present in the Synoptics. And he makes the point that there is a reward, that anyone who receives these people, or a prophet who is a prophet, deserves a reward. They're like a prophet, and anyone who supports a righteous person, well, they will be considered righteous for what they've done, and a cup of cold water is going to bring a reward. So you can see that this whole chapter has really been about a number of things, but at the core is the sending out of the disciples, and the fact that so much is going to happen to them as they go out to preach the word of God. Opposition, sometimes opposition even to death, but they are to go forward. The Spirit of God is going to be there with them, and help them, and really they are taking up the cross that Jesus himself carried. So that's the end of chapter 10. Well, let's pause there, and if anybody has any questions, we can respond to them. There is a question there. Jesus warns his disciples that will be rejected and persecuted. How should we understand success if rejection is expected? I think the success in the face of rejection is what the book of Revelation affirms, to stand firm. Book of Revelation, writing about living in an environment that is unsympathetic to your faith. Really, the task is to stand firm in your faith, and I think success in what the apostles are being asked to do is to stand firm. But of course, standing firm is success. We've just seen that when they come before the tribunals, that's evidence to these tribunals of who they are, evidence of the gospel. So I think that standing firm is important, and I think it's true in our society today. I do think we live in a society that's not as contrary to the community as the Roman Empire was, but there's no doubt that there's not the same sense of communion, the same sense of being what we were in the past is present in our society today. And we are to stand firm. And I mentioned that standing firm is a proclamation, but it's not a proclamation if people don't stand firm and let others know that they are disciples of Jesus. I think that's what the standing firm means. Standing firm is meant to announce Jesus. So a lot of people today have difficulty in saying, I'm a Catholic. That's not the politically correct thing to say today. And yet we are called to do that, particularly in a situation where it isn't politically correct, when the society is not seeing it as we see it. And I think that if we stand firm, we are witnessing, and that means that we are succeeding, because we are meant to witness to the gospel and to Jesus just by our very being who we are. Now, I don't think there's any other questions, but can I just remind you, I said last week that Dr. Laurie Woods was going to come, but I mucked it up. He's not coming tonight. I came tonight, but he will definitely come for the next 2 Saturdays. Dr. Laurie Woods is a well-known scripture scholar. Laurie has been involved with the sort of movement that we are now, going back 40 years, in the establishment of our centre, of which all of this work is a sort of a consequence. He made a major contribution, and I assure you that he will be worth listening to over the next 2 Saturday nights.